Ubuntu 26.04 to me marks the complete fall off of Ubuntu as a platform. Now, I'm not saying that Ubuntu is a bad distribution to install and run, but as a platform that I would want to build something off of, whether it's a Linux distro or even just my own personal system using the Ubuntu package base, I cannot recommend Ubuntu as a platform anymore. And this video is going to be going over why. So this isn't going to be a specific review of Ubuntu 26.04 because I believe you have to be running a distro for maybe at least 3 months before you can give a full review, and I don't have the spare hardware to do that. And this video is coming out the same day as Ubuntu 26.04 is. But I think what's going on with this release cycle of Ubuntu brings up a lot of interesting points that a lot of people are missing with looking at Ubuntu as a whole when talking about it. Anyways, sorry I missed my upload schedule yesterday. I woke up yesterday and I felt like I got hit by a bus. I was really sick and I'm still a little bit sick, so this video is probably gonna have to be highly edited because I'm having sick brain fog. First off, what do I mean by a platform? Now, this slide I stole from my upcoming Fedora video that I recorded 2 weeks ago and haven't uploaded yet because Fedora keeps delaying its release. Fedora video that will eventually come out. I will go into more detail on this, but essentially, once a distribution gets big enough, it goes from just being a ISO that someone installs off of a USB and runs on their computer, over to being a full platform that is going to power entire ecosystems of operating systems. So you have Debian, which gives you rock solid stability, a community-driven yet conservative package base, and if you go to their website, they call themselves the universal operating system. Now, Ubuntu, I'm separating from Debian because the package base is very different, but this is supposed to be a Debian-based operating system that is more user-friendly, and you also get commercial backing from Canonical. Now, Ubuntu is making a lot of different design decisions that separate it from Debian. And then you have the Arch platform. So Arch is bleeding edge, rolling release, minimal, DIY, and you can build it to be exactly what you want it to be just from a repository essentially of fresh packages. And then finally, we have the Fedora and Red Hat ecosystem. Now, even though I'm separating Ubuntu and Debian, I'm combining these because Red Hat does collab a lot with the Fedora community. And generally, if you know how to use a Fedora system, then using a Red Hat system is going to be basically the same, just a couple versions behind maybe. But Fedora is upstream first, it's cutting edge, but with good QA. They actually test things, and it feeds directly into Red Hat Enterprise Linux. So if you're interested in that, stay tuned for when the Fedora 44 comes out and I can upload my Fedora platform video. Now let's talk about how Ubuntu became such a big distribution in the first place with Ubuntu's golden age. So Ubuntu came out in 2004, and at the time there hadn't been a Linux distribution that was as easy as Ubuntu. And they did a lot of really smart marketing moves to help establish themselves. Like, you used to be able to just request a free CD of Ubuntu. They called themselves Linux for Human Beings. The LTS version was a very stable base, and it was inheriting Debian's package quality. And then the non-LTS versions are a bit faster moving than Debian. So you can still run something that is similar enough to Debian while also getting the latest GNOME on your Ubuntu install. And the release cycle was predictable. And then I didn't put this in the slide, but if you were looking at some of the things that were competing against Ubuntu at the time, such as the RPM family of distros, the Yum package manager just wasn't as mature as the apt package manager was. And back in the day, you would have a lot more dependency issues of RPM distros. So this isn't really a thing now if you're running a modern version of Fedora, but back then that was a real problem. And at this time, Debian itself was very, very, very difficult to install. Linus Torvalds, the creator of Linux, even he didn't like Debian because of how hard it was to install. And so with all of that, if you wanted to build a new Linux distribution, you wanted just a stable, reliable base, Ubuntu just quickly became the go-to because all the other options just kind of sucked. And so nowadays you have Linux Mint, Elementary, Pop! OS, Zorin OS. Those are just the ones I thought of off the top of my head when I was making these slides. All of these distributions have thrived building on top of Ubuntu. Now, where do things start to go wrong in Ubuntu's story? Well, 2011 GNOME 3 releases, and this starts to create the first wave of controversy for Ubuntu because GNOME 3's initial releases were completely unusable for the first 2 years. It was missing basic features, it was buggy, it was a resource hog, it performed terribly. Just every bad thing you could think about a desktop environment was GNOME 3 for the first 2 years. This resulted in Linus Torvalds famously switching from GNOME to XFCE, with him calling GNOME a and I quote, unholy mess. Now, a huge mistake that the GNOME team made is they discontinued GNOME 2 completely before GNOME 3 was ready. And then all of the other options available at the time just didn't work for what Ubuntu needed, because Ubuntu is supposed to be the flagship first impression experience that a new Linux user gets. So while something like XFCE or LXDE would have been stable, they're also lightweight desktops, they aren't prioritizing looks, and they're missing some features. Also at the time, KDE had just launched Plasma 4 back in 2008, and Plasma 4 had almost nearly just as bad of a launch as GNOME 3. And so they did fix Plasma 4 by the time GNOME 3 had come around, but just from how bad Plasma 4's launch was, Plasma 4 just had a terrible reputation, unfortunately. And then yes, there were a lot of new desktop environments that came out of this GNOME 3 transition, including Cinnamon, Mate, and Budgie, but they just didn't exist yet when Ubuntu needed to make a decision. Now, luckily for Canonical, they had this special version of Ubuntu called Ubuntu Netbook Edition. And so in this period of computing history from the late 2000s to the early 2010s, you had this huge trend of netbooks, which were these cheap computers that typically had pretty small and terrible screens. They were designed primarily just for browsing the internet and not really anything else. And so Ubuntu was trying to make a new desktop environment that was specifically designed to tailor this sort of new form factor of computing with the Unity desktop, and they designed that for their Ubuntu Netbook Edition. And so with Ubuntu Netbook Edition, they decided to build a new desktop environment called Unity that was supposed to work better on these smaller types of screens. But then eventually, when the GNOME 3 problems started happening and they had to figure out what to do, they decided to just make Unity the flagship desktop environment for Ubuntu. And so starting with Ubuntu 11.04, yep, they made a complete transition from GNOME to Unity for a while. Now, why am I talking about this in 2026? Well, this started to create the first hate for Ubuntu. So Unity at first was completely hated because it used more system resources than GNOME 2. On launch had a severe lack of customization. You couldn't even move the dock from the left to the bottom. And then Unity also had a huge focus on convergence. As I said earlier, it was made for netbooks, but people compared it to a tablet interface. And then Windows 8 started adding significant fuel to the fire, because Windows 8 added basically an actual tablet interface, even more so than Unity. And so people started hating on Windows 8, started looking at Linux as an alternative, and then they go to Ubuntu, and then, oh, I guess Ubuntu now has a tablet interface too. Now, additionally, Canonical added fuel to the fire because in 2012 up to 2016, they're adding Amazon search results to the Unity search, which would ping Amazon's URLs with whatever your search string was. And this resulted in Richard Stallman famously calling Ubuntu spyware for sending searches to Amazon. Now, I do think it is telemetry, but I do not think it's spyware. That's a little bit of a reach. Spyware would be like stealing your passwords or recording everything you do on your computer. Now, here is an example of something I would call spyware. Personally, I can see the hate with the Amazon, although it was a little bit overblown, but Unity I actually liked, so I'm not a Unity hater, but I get the Amazon hate. It is important to note that none of these things affected downstream distributions. So a Linux Mint based on Ubuntu wouldn't have to worry about any of the stuff Ubuntu is doing up here. Also, I meant to say this in the video and I'm editing it now and I forgot to say this, but just to clarify for beginning Linux users, in 2017, Ubuntu would switch back to GNOME 3, although they do tweak GNOME 3 to make it function somewhat how Unity used to function. That said, I do bring all of this up because all these little controversies that Ubuntu got into in the early 2010s, this made it very cool to hate on Ubuntu in the Linux space. And so now with all of the extra stuff Ubuntu's doing that I'm about to talk about, Ubuntu has just been getting a constant flood of hate, and not all of it is justified, but I do think the snap thing I'm about to talk about is justified, which leads me to snaps. So in 2016, Ubuntu released the Snap Package Manager as part of Ubuntu 16.04, and on launch, snaps were not very good. They used a ton of RAM, they had worse performance than native packages and even Flatpaks, and they didn't integrate at all with system themes. Nowadays, they do integrate a bit better with system themes, and the performance has improved, although it's still worse than Flatpak and native. But another key point of contention is that the Snap Store was never open sourced. Now, there's a few arguments arguments why they never open source the Snap Store. One of those is that it's tied with canonical infrastructure and they'd have to do a lot of work to open source it. But to that I say, well, they should have built it to be open source in the first place and you wouldn't have ran into these problems. And also you're hosting files essentially. Does that really use a lot of canonical infrastructure? And then I've also heard people say they spent a bunch of time trying to open source Launchpad, and then once they did, people didn't really self-host Launchpad at all. But to that argument, the AUR, that's open source. You can technically self-host the AUR, but do you really have a reason to? Like, why not just use the standard AUR that already exists, that already has thousands of other AUR packages on it? Now, snaps was something that both Ubuntu users and downstream distributions were able to just simply ignore. If you're an Ubuntu user, you could just delete snapd from your system and continue to keep using apt, and downstream distros just didn't have to ship it in the first place until 2019. Canonical started adding transitional packages that silently installed snap packages. So this started with the Chromium web browser. So if you were to apt install Chromium-web browser. So this all started with Chromium. If you were to apt install Chromium-browser, instead of grabbing just a typical apt Debian package, it would instead install snapd in the background if it wasn't already installed, and then install Chromium through the snap. Now, they argued that the reason they're doing this is because Chromium is such a complicated thing to package, which it is. They aren't wrong about that. That packaging it as one snap saves them a bunch of time from trying to package and maintain Chromium for every Ubuntu LTS and every in support non-LTS version of Ubuntu. And I could see that. But I think the better alternative would have just been to take it out of the repository and then tell people to use the snap. But what this did is, when you go and apt install Chromium and expect a deb package, you were getting a snap. If I wanted a snap, I would have done snap install Chromium, not apt install Chromium. They'd also later do this with Firefox and Thunderbird. And then in 2023, they made it so that Ubuntu flavors like Ubuntu Budgie, for example, would also not be able to ship Flatpaks anymore on their distribution. Now it's snap only. Now this is where both users and downstream distributions could no longer ignore this, because for one, if you're an Ubuntu user, like I said, you could just remove snap and not have to deal with it. But then now, if you weren't paying attention and you just tried to snap install Chromium, all of a sudden snap's back on your system and you're running Chromium through snap. And then now all of these other downstream Linux distros that, by the way, also didn't want Snap due to both performance stuff that I talked about and the Snap Store not being open source alike, all started having to come up with ways to work around or reverse what Ubuntu was trying to do with snaps. So Linux Mint right here, they complain about not being able to audit the Snap Store as well as the backdoor via apt. And so Linux Mint just straight up forbid the Snap Store from even being installed by the apt package manager in Linux Mint 20 and beyond. So in order to install Snap on Linux Mint, you have to remove this apt preference file and then install snapd manually. Now what Elementary OS did is they took a different approach where they just started shipping all of the apps on the system as Flatpak. So they have their own Flatpak repo with all the different like elementary apps right here. And by the way, Canonical, this is another use case of making Snap open source, is allowing distributions to do this with your Snap tech. But that aside, since Elementary OS has its own desktop environment with an app store, they just made it so the app store only uses Flatpaks and you only use apt essentially for system upgrades. Maybe Elementary OS should go atomic, but that's a different video idea. I'll talk about that next time Elementary has a release. Now Pop! OS with its new Cosmic desktop, older versions did use the Pop Shop, which is a fork of the Elementary OS app store, so I'm pretty sure that didn't ship snaps. But that aside, the modern version based on Cosmic has its own Cosmic app store, which supports devs and RPMs, including FlatHub and custom Flatpak sources, but notably it doesn't mention snap support anywhere. And then Zorin OS, they do enable Snap and Flatpak out of the box, and they just let you decide using GNOME Software Center. You can just select which type of package you want. So this does give the user a bit more choice, but if you also are brand new to Linux and don't know what's going on, I don't really think this is the best approach. People just want to click install and have the app installed. They don't want to think about this when they're brand new to Linux. Anyways, that aside, this is sort of the first area where Ubuntu as a platform is just becoming unpredictable for both users and downstream distributions. Now let's talk about the new release, Ubuntu 26.04 LTS. This is probably the most controversial LTS edition of Ubuntu that there has ever been. for a few reasons. First off, this is the first LTS version of Ubuntu that does not support an X11 session at all for GNOME. Now, this isn't technically Ubuntu's fault because they are shipping GNOME 50, which itself has completely dropped X11 support. And that said, GNOME 50 also has some significant Wayland improvements. I did a whole video about that already, but there are still a lot of people who need X11 just for hardware requirements. For example, a lot of older computers really struggle to run stuff through Wayland. So those types of users now are going to have to switch to a X11 desktop environment like XFCE. Now, that said, I don't think this is that big of a deal. People can just switch to a different desktop environment and keep using their hardware. They just might have to relearn some stuff if they're used to GNOME. But also, if you're on old hardware, you're probably not running GNOME anyway because of the resource use. But X11 is still in the repositories for Ubuntu, and other variants of Ubuntu can still ship X11 desktop environments. But just for Ubuntu proper users, there is no more X11. Now, let's talk about the other notable thing about Ubuntu. Ubuntu 26.04 was the first LTS distribution to ship with many Rust software rewrites, including sudo-rs, which is a Rust rewrite of sudo, and utils, which is a Rust rewrite of the GNU core utils. Now, to make it clear, I'm not one of those people who is trying to use a distribution that doesn't ship Wayland or systemd or just things of that nature. Generally, when new technology is around, I'm very open to it. And Rust as a technology has some genuine value. I actually plan on shipping some things written in Rust in stillOS, which is my Linux distro, by the way. Check it out. Rust comes with strict memory safety, and just the way you have to write the code, it's so strict that it kind of just prevents a lot of different types of bugs before you even click compile because of just how strict the code is when you write it. Rust has a lot of genuine value. For one, it's pretty much impossible to write code that isn't memory safe, given you're not using the unsafe keyword. And two, just the way you have to write Rust code is just so strict that it's genuinely pretty hard to write bugs, even logic errors in Rust, because if you didn't do it right the first time, it's very highly likely that it just won't compile. And so I'm catching a lot of bugs before the code is in production when I write code in Rust. So the problem here isn't the Rust programming language. The problem here is replacing things that aren't broken. So I think these Rust rewrites are a bad idea for several different reasons. Well, first off, GNU core utils and sudo have both had decades of testing and thousands of eyes auditing the code, both from companies who need to make sure that the code they're shipping is secure, but also the community too. And with that, CVEs are very rare and usually minor in those two projects here. Whereas on the opposite side, utils have already seen some real world issues. So the sort command wouldn't work on some large single line files. And then also a Ubuntu 25.10 update script ended up breaking because of a bug with the utils date utility, which to me is hilarious. So they aren't 100% binary compatible with each other, which is causing some executables that depend on core utils to break. And then utils also just has a heavy dependency tree, which significantly increases the supply chain attack surface for utils. Now, sudo-rs is also not a drop-in replacement. There's no plugin system, which breaks some audit logging setups that rely on that. It can break scripts thanks to not setting some environmental variables. And then some more advanced configurations inside of a sudo-rs file are not supported. And so the justification of this change is that you get the extra security benefits of Rust. You're not able to write unmemory safe code, things like that, but you're also replacing tools that were already extremely well audited and known to be secure, all doing that just for the theoreticals of Rust. The next thing I want to talk about is the kernel 7.0 timing. So less than 2 weeks ago of this recording, kernel 7.0 dropped, and this had some good kernel updates. One, Rust in the kernel is no longer experimental, and it adds numerous performance enhancements and hardware support, things like that. But that said, this version of Ubuntu came out only 11 days after this new kernel, which is not enough time for testing. Now, just for comparison's sake, Fedora, which is known for shipping kernels very quickly, including mid-release cycle, they usually take 3 or 4 weeks to ship a kernel. So 21 to 28 days total in order to ship a new Linux kernel. And then if we look at Ubuntu's past history, Ubuntu 20.04 took 151 days from the kernel ship's release date to its release date. 22.04 took 171 days. And then if we want to look at a non-LTS, 22.10 took 81 days. But then Canonical started getting a little bit more aggressive with how fast it ships its kernels. 24.04 for 24.1 shipped kernel 6.8 about 26 days after that released. And then after 24.04, Ubuntu changed its policy to be much more aggressive. So Ubuntu 25.10 also only took 11 days. And then Canonical even promised a day one update to bring kernel 7.0 to 26.04 if it got delayed to be after 26.04 came out. Are you serious? You're building a long-term support Linux distro and you're giving 11 days to test out one of the most important components of a Linux distribution? 11 days? Are you serious? That is simply just not enough time to test a full kernel, especially for an LTS. So what does all of this mean for you? Well, if you are building on top of Ubuntu, and I'm talking about both as a distribution builder, but also just someone who's trying to use Ubuntu to get work done or create their own customized system off of it, things like that. One, you're gonna have to worry about snaps. Will Canonical force more important packages like Firefox and Chromium to end up being snap? And then two, the Rust transition. Are your tools and scripts still going to be behaving identically despite Ubuntu treating these Rust rewrites as drop-in replacements for the 30-plus-year-old GNU core utils? And then finally, bleeding-edge kernels in new LTS releases. Can you trust the stability of a kernel that has only been tested for 11 days before release? Yes, Canonical will probably backport fixes and things like that, but still a shaky foundation for a Linux distribution, in my opinion. And these are just all of the Ubuntu-specific things. This is on top of already dealing with the current transitions Linux is going through, such as the X11 to Wayland transition. And so Ubuntu used to be a dependable platform you could rely on and build on, and now downstream maintainers need to spend more time reversing and working around Ubuntu's decisions. And it's kind of funny because if you've been around in the Linux community, there's always some sort of flavor of the month where, as Google AI describes it, a distro that is seeing a surge in popularity, often due to a new release, a feature update, or a recommendation from a tech influencer. And I've seen this happen time and time again. Right now, it's mostly happening with CachyOS and Bazite, but I remember it happening back in the day with Nabara, with Garuda Linux, with even 2018, we're talking it was Solus. And if it's a flavor of the month, it's not usually a bad Linux distro, but it's just something funny that goes on in the Linux space a lot of the time. But if we just Google current flavor of the month Linux and use whatever answer Google's AI gives us, none of these are Ubuntu based anymore. We're getting CachyOS. We're getting Bazite, we're getting Fedora, and it's saying Plasma 6. Okay, this answer isn't the greatest, and so I think a lot of developers are taking notice of some of the problems going on with Ubuntu, and that's why you aren't really seeing any new Ubuntu-based distros. Maybe, wasn't there the one made by the Microsoft employee? Android OS. This was flavor of the month for a second, and it is based on Ubuntu, but like other than that, I just haven't been seeing any Ubuntu-based flavors coming out. I remember people talking about Amarchi for a while. That's Arch based. Okay, I can't think of many other recent flavors of the month, but the point is, it seems like developers are also taking notice of how unreliable of a base Ubuntu has become, and that's why it's becoming pretty hard to find a brand new distribution based on Ubuntu. It's all Arch and Fedora now. With that said, what do you guys think? Am I wrong here? Do you guys still think Ubuntu is super reliable? What do you think of the Ubuntu Rust transition? And is 11 days enough time to test a new kernel? Let me know in the comment section below. If you like this video, you might like my video about why Flatpak won out. You can also subscribe right here. I'm just about to hit 10K, and help support a broke college student on Patreon and contribute to the new microphone fund. I know I need to get a new mic. Anyways, thank you for watching. Anyways, have a good weekend.